about to unfold today is a dark aspect of mainstream Protestant evangelical Christianity. In other words, immorality in Protestant Christianity. Ravi Zacharias is a popular name in Christian circles in most of the world. For those of you to whom Ravi's name does not ring a bell, he is Indian-born Canadian-American apologist who was born in Madras and to Malayali parents. His family moved to Delhi when he was very young. Later they moved to Canada when he was 20, where he earned his undergraduate degree from a Bible university and then his Master of Divinity. Ravi's evangelism was a huge success because of the way he positioned his theology. He claimed that Christianity was a unique worldview because of its ability to answer some of the most crucial questions about origin, meaning of life, morality, and destiny. Ravi was especially popular among the educated youth in India because in claiming to answer these spiritual questions that I just talked about, Ravi made use of a lot of jargon, terminology of logic, and alluded to science that made his speeches look intelligent. But whether or not his pseudo-logic made any valid sense is beside the point. The real question is, for someone like Ravi, who based his evangelism on morality that Christianity allegedly teaches, and for someone who claimed that all morality flowed from the Christian God, does Ravi's life hold up to moral scrutiny? Does he practice a moral life? Namaste viewers, and welcome to the Ex-Christian Show, the insider's view of Christianity from the outside. Lies, fraud, forgeries, and deception. These are nothing new to Christianity. And by the admission of the very founders of Christianity, it is what Christianity was founded upon. They are all justified in the name of the Christian God and his alleged kingdom, saying, ends justify the means. But if you thought such deception is only a thing of the past, and that it was practiced only in the early centuries when Christianity was being invented and pushed into the masses, then you're utterly mistaken. Deception continues in the Christian world to this day. Only now the fraudsters wear expensive tuxedos. So the case in point is a person called Ravi Zacharias. The name of Ravi Zacharias is not unknown to Indians, most definitely not to Indian Christians. We at Intellectual Kshatriya have vowed to expose this guy for who he is, a fraudster. So borrowing from Randall Rouser, Ravi, the chronic fabulist, and the lying apologist. Joining us on this expose is our guest from California, Steve Baughman. Steve is an attorney by profession and by all means possesses the investigative acumen to conduct an in-depth scrutiny of Zacharias' life and lies. Steve has exposed the real Ravi Zacharias that hides behind that soft, righteous-looking smile. Steve has documented his findings in a book called Cover Up in the Kingdom, Phone Sex, Lies, and God's Great Apologist, Ravi Zacharias. Steve also broadcasts through his YouTube channel called Friendly Banjo Atheist. Welcome to the Ex-Christian Show, Steve.
Thank you for having me, Esther.
Thank you. You said in your book, and I quote, as one who suffered much during his own faith transition away from evangelical Christianity, end quote. So were you an evangelical Christian? If so, for how long and how strong?
Yes, I was born and raised outside the United States, and I grew up actually in Southeast Asia around Baptist missionaries primarily. And I was very impressed with their integrity. I was very interested in their faith. And I grew up sort of believing it, but always struggling with doubts. But I went through several periods, especially in my late teens until I was about 20, of having intense evangelical beliefs and a commitment. I was hoping to become a missionary, and I was very active in my church and in my college youth group. And I was also constantly suffering from that still small voice that told me that I really don't know if this is true. And I eventually, at about the age of 20, I decided I can't keep doing this. I have to just admit to myself and to others that it really isn't something that I can believe. And this was very painful because this has been something I had loved and associated myself with my whole life. Um, but I just have to admit that I can't quite believe it. In fact, the more I learn, the less I believe it. And it was very painful.
I'm sure. So, Steve, why should any Christian watching this believe what you say about their favorite apologist, Ravi Zacharias? What makes you an authority over Ravi's life, his credentials, and character?
Well, first thing I would do is to speak to any Christians who are watching and who may be Ravi Zacharias fans, because I get accused a lot of, simply because I don't believe in God, of being out to harm Christianity. And I did not set out to harm Ravi Zacharias. I'm very fond of some great Christian intellectuals. I have some professors. I'm a philosophy student at a Christian school. I have a lot of respect for the real Christian philosophers. And I was looking for the best and the brightest Christian apologists. About 5 years ago, I happened upon a man named Ravi Zacharias. And the fact that he was so eloquent, but he also was a professor at Oxford and he had been educated at Cambridge. When he spoke, I thought, this is a man with real authority. And he made one particular argument about the book of Daniel that impressed me very much. And I thought, if this is true, I need to change from my atheism and start reconsidering Christianity very seriously again. And I looked into it, and the argument was basically very dishonest. And I wondered why a man with such impeccable Cambridge and Oxford credentials would stoop to that level. And I began investigating and found that Ravi didn't have Oxford or Cambridge credentials. He had made it all up. And he had done this openly and publicly. And then I began to contact his ministry about this and noticed that they weren't interested in letting this get out. They took very clear steps to cover it up. And this was all very disappointing, and it made me want to investigate even more. And 5 years later, we're finding so many things about the great apologist of our time, Ravi Zacharias, things that he has deceived fans, donors, and millions of people about.
So you were saying when you went back and referred to what he said about Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, you found it was a dishonest teaching or reference to Daniel. So what is dishonest about that part?
The basic thing is Ravi made an impassioned speech where he spoke about how Daniel was written hundreds of years before Alexander the Great, but it pointed in such specific detail to Alexander the Great, and that this could only have been the work of a prophet of God. Well, I looked into it and I realized that the vast majority of Christian scholars who specialize in Old Testament, who are not fundamentalist Christians, believe that the book of Daniel was written after Alexander the Great. I felt that at very least, Ravi should have disclosed that to his audience. I'm not an expert on the book of Daniel. Don't ask me anything about the different languages in the book of Daniel or the dating, but scholars disagree very strongly with what Ravi was telling his college student audience. And I just thought he should have disclosed that, and that's a very dishonest thing of him to do. And that got me going on looking further.
Okay, so when you say it was written after Alexander, do you have a date? I know I heard you saying, don't ask me anything about the dating, but scholars do have a date on it now, right?
Yes, it was written during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, which was about, I don't remember the exact date, but about 120 BC, which was well after Alexander the Great. It wasn't written in the 6th century BC like Ravi told his audience.
Yeah. They also have a date of 167 BCE.
I think that's right. I think that may be the correct date. Yes, thanks, Esther. So,
Yeah.
but either way, it's well after Alexander the Great. So Ravi should not have done that. That was a deceptive thing to do. Not a big deal, but a big enough deal to get me looking deeper.
Probably Ravi did not know it himself at that point. The dating, the correct dating.
Ravi actually mentions in his own autobiography that the dating of Daniel was a difficult issue for him when he was in seminary. So he's well aware that there's controversy.
Okay, okay. Steve, the very reason I'm doing this is this particular talk with you, who is an expert on Ravi Zacharias. Um, Exposing Zacharias to Indian Christians is really important at this point. And because this is so important, I want to unravel this meticulously. So I see three aspects of Zacharias that need to be exposed: Zacharias and his credentials, Zacharias and his theology, and Zacharias and his moral character. A lot of Indian Christians pride in Ravi Zacharias, and many Christian youngsters are influenced by his faux apologetics, his distorted logic, and false historical narratives. Um, I have to tell you, I know of some youngsters that have converted to Christianity against the desire of their families and use Zacharias's pseudo logic, beside, of course, other ridiculous arguments that are available on the internet, to justify their conversion. And this causes a great anguish to their parents, and thereby causing a divide in their own families that are still Hindu. So I want to start at the very starting of Zacharias's Christian life. So, but did you know there are contradictions in his conversion story that are available online?
Yes, there are the conversion story that Ravi tells is very much a part of who he is. It was a dramatic conversion, and he contradicts himself so many times, and he makes so many implausible claims to cover up the misstatements he previously made that I really just don't believe he attempted suicide as a young man. The story, as you know, is very dramatic. Ravi was a very troubled man, and he wanted to be loved and admired, and he felt like a failure. Now, the story is that at age 17, he finally decided that he would end his life. So he went to his school one day in Delhi, and school was in session, and he went to the chemistry lab and somehow managed to break into the cabinet and steal poison. And he went home, and the next day, when nobody was home except a servant, he swallowed this poison and nearly died. He vomited, and then he lost consciousness, and the servant got him to the hospital. And while he was in that hospital, lying on his, what he calls his bed of suicide, somehow mysteriously a man from Youth for Christ, an Indian man named Fred David, appeared in the hospital room and gave Ravi's mother a Bible. And the mother read Ravi the Bible passage that Mr. David had wanted him to read. And Ravi's eyes opened, and he vowed there on his bed of suicide to commit himself to Jesus. And he promised God, I will leave no stone unturned in my pursuit of truth. So he describes this in extremely dramatic terms. I encourage everyone who wants to know about Ravi Zacharias to read his autobiography. This was a moment of divine appointment at that hospital. It was a moment of God coming down and rescuing him from the jaws of damnation. Very, very flowery language. And he's told the story to countless people. Millions and millions of people know the story of Ravi's bed of suicide, dramatic rescue by the Lord Jesus Christ. And it probably is not true. One of the things that I experienced very much in my evangelical days is if you have a dramatic conversion, if you're a bad person and then you get Jesus and you have a dramatic conversion, you're cool, right? That's considered a mark of prestige. And I heard people who were born and raised in the faith and didn't have these dramatic conversions feeling like they were spiritually uninteresting because they didn't have that sort of conversion. I remember one time a murderer came to my Baptist church in California and talked about how he'd been a murderer, but he found Jesus. That guy was cool. right? And so there's prestige points if you have a dramatic conversion. And as we now know, Ravi was first and foremost concerned about his public image, and he needed a dramatic conversion story. Now, I also have to say, honestly, his story may be true, but there are so many things wrong with it, which I'm happy to talk about. And his family has been so reluctant to answer my most simple questions about this. His brother Ramesh, a famous doctor in Ramesh Zacharias, a famous doctor in Toronto, actually called the police when I simply sent him an email and a voicemail saying, I would like to know if your brother Ravi really did try suicide when he was a kid. If you tell me he did, I will drop my investigation. I will take you at your word. Rather than simply telling me, yes, Ravi attempted suicide as a kid, he called the police. So when you take that sort of behavior and you look at Ravi's story in detail and find massive contradictions and massive implausibilities, it's just really hard to believe that it happened. And it's very easy to see that he made it up because it is good for his prestige.
Right.
And I can give you specific examples also if you'd like.
Nice, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. One of the more suspicious things is that I began investigating Ravi in around middle of 2019 last year, and he learned that I was investigating him, and I know this because I'd spoken to his people about my investigation. Shortly after he learned that I was investigating him, he went on a very big Christian television show in the U.S., and he said that his medical records from the hospital would show that he had had an accident, that it was not suicide. Now, this timing was very interesting. He said the medical records show a gastroenterological mishap. But why did he wait 56 years to disclose that? And then he disclosed it only a few months after he learned that someone was investigating his claim, right? He also claims that what happened at the hospital. It was called the Weldington Hospital in 1963 when Ravi attempted suicide in Delhi, a very famous hospital. It's still there, and what happened at that hospital was so important to Ravi that every time he goes to Delhi, he takes a taxi by himself, just him and the taxi driver, and he goes and he sits in front of that hospital and he weeps and he thinks about how this is where it all started. So he's been to that hospital now at least 50 times in the taxi, but he doesn't know the name of the hospital. It's Weldington Hospital. He misspelled the English name in his autobiography. In 1970s, the name changed to the Ram Manohar Lohia Hospital, which is what it's called now. In the 1970s, every lecture I have seen Ravi give where he describes this suicide, he can't name the hospital. He gets the name wrong. So this just doesn't make sense. And I have a long article where I go through all of um, these very puzzling things. You'd think that someone who's telling the truth would not make mistakes like that. But I finally took Ravi's testimony and I shared it with an emergency room doctor. I sent it to an ER doctor who said it's possible, but it's a little far-fetched to think that someone who takes poison and vomits would also lose consciousness. So none of this is conclusive. And I will tell you that Ravi has a brother-in-law named Sundar Krishnan, was a famous nuclear scientist, an Indian man who moved to Canada right around the time Ravi did. He and Ravi were soulmates. They were brothers in Christ at the earliest days. This man knows whether Ravi Zacharias' suicide story is true. But this man seems to be distancing himself from Ravi. That's just the feeling I get. But if Sundar Krishnan would come out and say, yes, Ravi did attempt suicide when he was 17 years old, I would be inclined to believe it because he's a man of great integrity, as far as I know. But when I called Mr. Reverend Krishnan, he's now a pastor, a man of integrity by all accounts. When I called him and emailed him through his church, I said, please, I just want to know, did Ravi commit suicide or not? And he never got back to me. So something is going on here, and this is one of the few stories I'm telling you where I think I could be wrong. The other stories I'll tell you about Ravi and his credentials and his sexual issues are very, very well established.
We'll get to that in a bit. But I want to dwell a little bit on his conversion story. Apart from what you just said, it's all inconclusive. But the contradictions that I was talking about, so you said Youth for Christ. So YFC stands for Youth for Christ. So YFC website talks about his conversion story. So there it says that first Ravi was not doing so well in his school. Then his sisters suggested him to attend this Youth for Christ rally, Christian rally, and then he goes there, and that's where he becomes a Christian. And soon after that, I want the viewers, I want you to make note of this sequence. So he goes to a Christian rally organized by Youth for Christ, and there he becomes a Christian. He attends something that Christians call an altar call, and he goes to the front, to the stage, and commits his life to Jesus Christ. Basically, that's the conversion. That's the moment of conversion in a Christian, the born again experience. So it happens there. And soon after that, for some reason, for some unknown, undisclosed reason, he attempts suicide. That's what the YFC website says. But if you go to his own website, the RZIM website, it says that he was first a skeptic, and as a skeptic, he attempted to commit suicide. Now, why this sequence is so important? Because in one of his interviews, as recently as 2018, if I'm right, to a website, Christian website, he says that, and I quote, "The fact that I tried to take my life is a devastating thought to me. The only consolation I have is that I did not know Christ at that time." So, are we talking about a skeptic attempting to commit suicide and then having a moment of a born again experience? Or is it a Christian, somebody who already had a born again Christian experience, attempting to commit suicide? So why I'm asking this is YFC is not a small organization. It has a reputation for itself. So when they're putting out something as important as a testimony of an apologist who is followed by millions of people around the world, I'm sure they get their facts right. So it could be only that Ravi's bio just got embellished as years progressed. Do you think that's what is happening here?
It's hard for me to say, Esther, because if, as a defense lawyer, I can think of ways to reconcile those contradictions. I don't know if it's true. I mean, Ravi's made so many contradictions that could just be another one. But I do know it's possible that he had his Youth for Christ conversion and then fell away. And then his bed of suicide conversion is where the Jesus thing really took a hold. So, I mean, I remember as I had several conversion experiences in my youth, but I would always say this one is the real one. So it could be that that's what's happening, but I don't know. I think you make a good point.
Okay. Probably you could use that as as a reference point for your further study that you're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a lot more, and there are, for example, Ravi didn't start publicly talking about his suicide till guess when? The year after his father died.
Which year was that?
His mother died in 74, his father died in 79, and the first reference, public reference that I've found that Ravi makes to his suicide is in the Milwaukee Journal in 1980. So we're talking about a man who claims to be committed to Jesus Christ and sharing the gospel and the power of the blood of Jesus to transform it and how it saved him on that bed of suicide. That was 1963. Why did he wait till 1980, until the year after his father died, to share it? Well, one possibility is that his father knew it didn't happen, right? Ravi also talks about how, well, I had to keep it quiet because it was a shameful thing to my father. But his father was a Christian who one assumes would be proud to have his son have been saved in such a dramatic fashion. So it really, all the pieces, or at least almost all the pieces, point to Ravi creating his own rebirth narrative in a way that makes him look more interesting and more profound and more authoritative.
Right. It's really interesting how Jesus always chooses to walk stealthily into the lives of vulnerable people. Sometimes he visits a convict in a prison who's charged with probably rape and murder, like you just stated in an example. Or he chooses to walk into a family that is crushed under a huge pile of debt.
Mhm.
And in this case, he has walked into a hospital, and surprisingly, Ravi Zacharias was lying in a state of we don't know what, under maybe probably under the influence of some heavy medication. So yeah, it's interesting how Jesus always chooses to walk into the lives of those that are either distressed or vulnerable. That's something that needs a great study.
Well, may I make one more comment about person walking into the hospital room? This is another odd thing. The man named Fred David, I can't remember, did I already tell you this? Fred David went into Ravi's hospital room with a Bible. I mentioned that. But what I didn't tell you is Ravi frequently said to his audiences that he does not know how Fred David was allowed to enter the hospital. Right? Here's a young man who committed a juvenile who committed suicide. Suicide was a crime in India at the time. They would have been handling this case very carefully, but they let this man named Fred David come in right into Ravi's hospital room. Ravi does not know how Fred David got in. But why didn't Ravi ask Fred David this? Fred David lived in, had moved to the US, lived in Los Angeles, died in 2013. Ravi and Fred David were very close until the end of Fred David's life. Ravi even spoke to Fred David a few days before he died, as far as I recall. Why did Ravi not simply ask Fred, how did you get into that hospital room? Well, he never did.
Interesting. Interesting.
But this is just one piece in the puzzle that shows that points really to Ravi Zacharias being a fundamentally deceptive man. And the really scary thing for me is, okay, there's corrupt preachers, there's corrupt sadhus, right? There's corrupt holy men, there's corrupt, lots of religious leaders and non-religious leaders are corrupt. But how did he get away with this? It was
Right.
so bold. Esther, you described me as an expert on Ravi. I've only become knowledgeable about this because I sat at my computer and did a lot of research, and I made a few phone calls. There's no magic to this. I don't have any special expertise. I don't have inside scoops to anybody. You can all do it yourself. If you're still a committed Ravi fan, sit at your computer, dedicate a lot of time to it, and you'll find that everything I'm saying is right there on the record. Almost all of it is publicly available.